Hello, this is Hannah from Zoek UK Job Board. I am delighted to be joined by Michael Tobin OBE today, technology entrepreneur and pioneer with over 30 years of experience in the telecom sector. Thank you very much for joining me on this interview. As the former CEO of Telecity, you now hold multiple non-executive director and chairman roles with progressive businesses in the data center and technology industries, and have also managed many successful exit strategies. Now chairman of Audioboom, you regularly share your experiences on the Tobin Podcast and also enjoy inspiring others through your collection of books. So for this interview, I would like to ask a few questions about how you've succeeded in your career and what advice you can give job seekers for their future career developments.
Okay, sounds good.
Brilliant. So Michael, can you tell me how you first started out in your chosen field?
I grew up in the East End of London, and my dad was quite a violent chap and had a gang. So my mother escaped and we went to Africa, where we were frequently petrol bombed and shot at, and eventually got back when I was 12, and essentially became a refugee coming back into my own country. So stayed in a squat in Stockwell with nothing for a couple of years, and started, I was making money by basically breaking into the old condemned houses waiting for demolition. You'd find upright pianos, and you would roll the pianos down the Old Kent Road and sell them in East Street Market for £20 each, and we survived for a couple of years like that. So naturally I probably missed out a little bit on schooling. So I left school at 16 and wanted to do an apprenticeship, and was lucky enough to get a role with a company called Rockwell Automation. And it was a electrical electronics engineering apprenticeship. So did that, and at the tender age of 20, decided that I was going to set the world alight with various managerial roles and everything else, and was lucky enough to get a couple of easy deals where I'd sort of joined a company that I probably didn't have the experience of doing the job. But that's one thing actually that I've found is I always used to go for a job that I kind of assumed I couldn't do. And it was more about your attitude. If you think you can do it, then you'll probably learn on the job anyway. And when I look at people for jobs today, I look for an attitude rather than a skill set. So I'd rather train a skill set than have to train an attitude. So if someone comes in with the right attitude and has never done the job before, that's fine by me.
Yeah.
So yeah, just pushing the boundaries each time. That's how I started.
Brilliant. What has your biggest challenge been?
When I joined Redbus, which was the precursor to Telecity, it was a data center company. I didn't do any due diligence before I'd come in, but it was burning cash at 2.4 million a month, and we had about 6 million left in the bank. So it was very close to bankruptcy. And it had about 500 employees, and I had to take that 500 people down to 80 in one announcement. And I was sworn at, spat at, and it was just a horrible thing. I mean, it was just before Christmas as well, and I was having to lay these people off. And the only thing I could remember was concentrating on the 80 jobs I was trying to save rather than the 420 that I was having to let go. But I'd say that was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
Mm-hmm. What has your proudest achievement been?
Well, there's lots of things to mention, but that £6 million market cap business that was virtually bankrupt, we sold for 3.6 billion 12 years later. So that was a lot of fun, and built a family of leadership team around me that I've used again and again over time in other businesses.
If you could start over, would you do anything differently, and why?
So at home I try to tell the kids no regrets, right? Because you're the product of all your experiences, and if you start sort of, first of all, you can't change the past, right? So it's an irrelevance. But if you start to sort of say, well, if I could have done that instead of that, then you end up taking different paths. And if you then start to say, well, actually, am I happy where I am? Am I, is where I am a good place to be? Then you effectively, you shouldn't be thinking about having done something differently, because that is the path you've taken.
And have you experienced any failures? And if so, what have you learned from them?
Well, just as I don't use the word regret, I also don't use the word failure at home. And we say either we succeed at something or we learn about it, right? So it's success or learning.
Yeah.
And so if you look at it that way, there are no failures. It's knowing how not to do something, right? And I apply this in attitude, not just in business attitude, but in all attitude. And the guy that taught me how to sell back in my very, very early 20s actually was Brian Adams's cousin, believe it or not, which is another story. But he used a great example that I often talk to sort of young commercially minded people. And he would say, look, imagine you're a broom salesman and you've got the best broom, it's a sort of lovely handle and a nice broom head and it works really well. But you also know not everyone's going to buy your broom, right? And you're a 100-year-old family company, and on average that you're going to sell one broom every 100 doors you knock on, because 98 doors already have a broom. One of them doesn't have a broom but can't afford yours, but one of them doesn't have a broom and can afford yours and buys it. So you know the stats. So you come to a sort of a terrace street and you start knocking on doors. Doesn't matter where you start, knock on a door, open it up. No thanks, got one. Bang. You should go, yes. Because you're one step closer to your sale, right? And the logic of hitting everything perfectly every single time or getting everything right every single time is nonsense. So failure, right, is part of the success journey, right? So if you then see failure as an absolute standard product in that journey, then you should embrace failure as you would embrace the success, because it's part of that process. So if you can get it that way, then you start to look at it in a completely different way. First of all, it doesn't get you down, because in advance you're going to have pitfalls. So, why on earth would they get you down? The difference between you and your competition is simply how quickly you get over the pitfall, right? And every barrier you put between you and your competition is a good thing, but you've got to get over that barrier to put it between you. So, it's looking at challenges that we would normally think of as failures, but seeing them as these kind of barriers between you and everyone else once you're past it.
What do you find to be true that most people would disagree with?
I do believe that not having a skill set for a job, as I mentioned earlier, is a good thing. And I guess most people would recruit based on somebody having done the job before and having the skills to do the job. And I completely disagree with that. I mean, the point is that they've left the existing job where they've got those skills for a reason. And if you're just going to put them in the same job with maybe £5 a week more, then someone else is going to come along with £5 a week more and take them again, right? So you've got to give them some other reason why they would want to be working for you. And I think, I find that's something maybe you don't find on day one with somebody. You've got to almost get to know them before you work out what makes them tick.
What charities do you support and why?
Well, I believe in a sort of a single ethos, which is education, empowerment and welfare of children. So all of my charity work has been around that. More recently, my wife and I trekked to in southern India for to raise money to build a refuge in a slum in Mumbai for trafficked girls, and that was with the British Asian Trust. A couple of years ago, I did 40 marathons in 40 days, getting up at 3:00 every morning, running a marathon before work, and that was we raised £150,000 for the Prince's Trust. How
would you avoid burnout?
People think of burnout generally as kind of working too much. And my second book is called Live, Love, Work, Prosper. And it's about how work-life balance doesn't exist. And we've now experienced that in spades because of the lockdown and working from home. And, and the book is all about integrating work and life. And then you don't feel like, I've worked too much, I need a break. Because you're integrating your normal world and working. Now, it's not possible with some people. It's very difficult for a bus driver to have, integrate normal work and life, right? When they're driving a bus, they're driving a bus, and when they're not, they're not. But for a lot of us, there's a lot of, there is an ability to integrate much more work into our general life. And then we don't have this kind of, instead of working 8 hours today, I've worked 15 hours and I'm burning out.
Mm-hmm. What is your opinion on the saying, work smarter, not harder?
Well, I think that's probably very true. These are semantics at the end of the day, right? So, if you work smarter and harder, then that's even better than either or. And if you work harder than not working hard, that's better. That's better too. So, there's always, I say there's semantics, but I do think it's much more efficient to think about how you do things and why you do things rather than just do more of them. Mm-hmm. And we live in a world where Uber has become a verb as well as a noun. And, we say that company's been Ubered. In other words, yesterday it was a great company and now it's irrelevant. Right? So, the interesting thing there is since the beginning of time, especially in technology, we've kind of looked at evolution. We've looked at development as how do I do things quicker, cheaper, easier, and you go from kind of an ox to a plow to a giant combine harvest, so all these things are kind of like doing more. And now for the last sort of 5 to 10 years, it's about how do I not have to do that again? Mm-hmm. And this is a really fundamental difference in terms of innovation. And the rate of change of technology is so fast now that the barriers to development very often are our ability to absorb the technology rather than the technology itself. There's almost enough technology out there to do whatever you want. It's our ability to imagine the outcomes that's the restricting point now.
What would you look for when you hire someone?
So attitude. It's, if you can get a sense of the capabilities from a CV, mm-hmm. But just because someone hasn't done the job that I want them to do doesn't put me off employing them at all. Because those are the things you can learn. Now, obviously, if you're a doctor, having experience in surgery, you're not going to say, I'm going to recruit this guy as a brain surgeon if he doesn't know anything about brain surgery. But in general, I think it's much more valuable having the attitude right. And I look for things that people have done in their lives that, things like Duke of Edinburgh Awards is a great, for a young person that doesn't have a lot of experience on their CV. Having things like D of E makes a differentiator.
What do you pay attention to the most when conducting an interview?
Well, I like people to ask questions. People go to an interview with the mindset of I am being interviewed, which is, to an extent, it's true, right? But the interview is a two-way process. Mm-hmm. And you are also, as an interviewee, you are also deciding whether you're going to spend the next X amount of years of your life in that environment. And you want to know that it's going to be rewarding to you as well as rewarding to the company.
What top tips could you give somebody who is attending an interview?
Question subsets are really valuable, right? So when someone gives you a piece of information and you ask a question about it, and you ask a question about the answer, and you ask a question about the answer, you'll find that the fourth answer is nothing to do with the original comment, right? But it's so much more enlightening. So if someone says, we work 9 till 5 here. Oh, really? Why do you go for a 9 to 5? Well, because that's always been the rule. Really? It's always been the rules. Why has it always been the rules? Oh, well, no one's thought to change it. Oh, no one's thought to change it. Is there a more interesting way to do this then? So suddenly, you're in control of value creation in the interview, right? And you've got to be creating value for yourself in the eyes of the person in front of you, but you've also got to understand whether there's value there for you.
What short and long-term changes do you envisage as a result of coronavirus, both to your industry and the wider economy?
Airlines are in turmoil at the moment. I'm sitting here in my BA pajamas. I've probably got more sets of BA pajamas than BA has at the moment, is that they're really in tough times. But I don't see as many people traveling for business as before, with the proliferation now of Zoom and Skype and Blue Jeans and all these other online collaboration tools that were there before. Most of them, Microsoft Teams, all these things were there before. But now we have to use them, and now we've got very comfortable using them.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't do phone calls anymore. I'll rather use a Zoom call than a phone call. And that's quite interesting, the amount of increase in bandwidth that providers have had to put into people's homes. So we're now able to work from home more. So I don't think it's back to normal. I think almost everything in our world is going to be different.
How do you think coronavirus will affect the job market, both in the short term and the long term?
Well, I think, we've seen in the short term massive impact on the job market. We're likely to have a very significant hike in the unemployment rate, sadly. I think what it will do is it will get people to think about role flexibility a lot more. I mean, we had, during the financial crisis, we saw, a lot of bankers, not because all the banks made a lot of people unemployed at the same time. There were no jobs for bankers. So just because you were made unemployed, you couldn't go to another bank and get a job because there were no jobs. So they became, Uber drivers and different things and set up their own business. And so I think this isn't one of those situations again where there's a lot of unemployment. And I think as well that we sort of think about jobs. We used to think about jobs for life. Well, now obviously there are no jobs for life, but there's probably no careers for life as well. So the typical 14-year-old today is going to end up having maybe 40 jobs in their life over 4 different separate careers. And so we should get more accustomed to be flexible in terms of how we think about our journey through employment.
How can you keep people motivated long term when remote working?
Well, you can institute games and things like that. I think Microsoft Teams and Zoom and all these sort of stuff are being used for social events now as well as business. Every Friday night, we have a group of friends that grab a whiskey and we'll sit around doing that, and that's become a little bit of a tradition now. And also, I think that we've seen pub quizzes, we've seen all these sorts of things. Motivation is something that also comes from the people that you're trying to motivate. So you can ask them. So, what sort of fun things would you want to do? Do you want to see a Zoom challenge where somebody gets in a bath of baked beans or something, and whatever it is, but something that you can ask out of your employees and say, how do you think? Again, it's the question thing, right? How do you think I could motivate you more?
How has coronavirus affected hiring and candidate demand in your industry?
Most of my businesses are in sort of immune environments, right? So data centers where we're using more data, broadband, we're using more broadband. Even podcasting is a business that's growing, regardless of whether we're at home or not. So in my industry, it hasn't really affected it negatively at all. In fact, businesses are still as strong as ever, if not stronger. Obviously, there are certain industries that doesn't apply to. The restaurant industry, the hospitality industry, travel, airlines, that sort of thing. I think that's going to take a long time to come back to where people are driving recruitment. Those industries are asking people to take early retirement, for example.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael. That was really useful. Thanks for taking the time to get involved.
Pleasure. No, it's always a pleasure to spend a bit more time on Zoom.